In August 2023, a jury in Manchester delivered one of the most consequential verdicts in modern British criminal history. A neonatal nurse, someone trained to protect some of the most vulnerable patients alive, was found guilty of murdering 7 bobbies and attempting to murder 6 others. Lucy Letby received 15 whole-life orders. She will never be released unless those convictions are overturned. But how does a jury move from a series of unexplained hospital deaths to a conclusion of murder? There was no single piece of evidence that answered that question. Instead, the prosecution presented a combination of medical evidence, staffing records, digital searches, handwritten notes, and a pattern of events that they argued pointed toward one person. Here are the 7 major strands of evidence the prosecution relied upon, and some of them remain deeply disputed. Between June 2015 and June 2016, the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital experienced a series of unexpected deaths and collapses. Consultants became increasingly concerned about what they were seeing. They searched for medical explanations. They examined infection, staffing, equipment, and the conditions affecting the bobbies. But as the incidents accumulated, another pattern began to emerge. Lucy Letby was repeatedly present when bobbies deteriorated. Eventually, the concerns became serious enough to trigger a police investigation. In 2017, Cheshire Police launched Operation Hummingbird. Investigators began examining medical records, staffing rotas, clinical notes, and digital evidence. And 7 major strands of evidence became central to the prosecution's case. Evidence 1. The staffing rota. The first was the staffing pattern. Investigators reconstructed the shifts worked by nurses and doctors and compared them with the timing of the deaths and collapses. The prosecution argued that Lucy Letby was the only nurse consistently present across the incidents being examined. That was significant, because if the collapses had been completely random, investigators would have expected different staff members to appear across the cases. Instead, they argued that one name kept appearing, Lucy Letby. The prosecution presented this pattern as powerful circumstantial evidence. It did not by itself establish how any baby had been harmed, but it helped explain why investigators began focusing their attention on one particular nurse. And from there, the medical evidence became crucial. Evidence 2, the insulin cases. 2 bobbies became central to the prosecution's allegation of deliberate insulin poisoning. Both experienced episodes of unexplained hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar. Laboratory testing detected insulin, but the prosecution argued that the accompanying C-peptide results indicated that the insulin had not been produced naturally by the bobbies' bodies. In other words, they argued that synthetic insulin had been introduced from outside. This was important because insulin poisoning leaves behind measurable biochemical evidence. The prosecution argued that the combination of the laboratory findings, the bobbies' clinical deterioration, and Letby's presence supported deliberate poisoning. Both bobbies survived, but the insulin allegations became some of the most significant medical evidence presented at trial. And then came one of the most controversial parts of the case, air embolism. Evidence 3. The air embolism theory. Several bobbies suffered sudden and unexpected collapses. Prosecution experts argued that some of these collapses were consistent with air being introduced into the bloodstream. The theory was that injected air could interfere with circulation and cause catastrophic deterioration. One of the important pieces of scientific literature discussed during the trial came from Canadian neonatologist Dr. Shu Lee. His research concerned the clinical effects associated with air embolism in newborn bobbies. The prosecution relied on that research when presenting its medical theory, but this evidence became heavily contested after the trial. In February 2025, Dr. Shu Lee appeared at a press conference with an international group of medical experts who had reviewed the cases. The panel said they found no medical evidence of deliberate harm in the 17 cases examined. Dr. Lee also said that his research had been misapplied. That does not mean the original convictions have been overturned. They have not. But it does mean that one of the central medical theories behind the prosecution's case is now being challenged by medical experts. And then there were the words found inside Letby's own home. Evidence 4, the handwritten notes. When police searched Lucy Letby's home, they discovered handwritten notes. Among them were deeply disturbing statements, including the words, "I am evil, I did this." Another note referred to killing Bobbies on purpose, because she was not good enough to care for them. For the prosecution, these words were extraordinarily significant. They argued that the notes amounted to an admission of guilt. But the defense offered a completely different interpretation. They argued that Letby had written the notes during a period of extreme emotional distress. She had been removed from frontline duties. Senior doctors had accused her of harming Bobbies. She knew that she was under investigation. And occupational health staff had encouraged her to write down her thoughts. The defense therefore argued that the notes represented anguish, self-blame, and psychological distress, not a confession to murder. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's interpretation. But the notes were not the only evidence concerning Letby's behavior. Investigators also examined what she had been searching for online. Evidence 5, the online searches. Police examined Letby's computer and phone activity. They found searches involving the names and Facebook profiles of parents connected to Bobbies who had died. The prosecution argued that these searches were significant. They suggested that Letby had an unusual interest in the families after the deaths. In some cases, the searches occurred after the Bobbies had died. The prosecution presented this as circumstantial evidence of a continuing fixation with the families. But again, the defense offered another explanation. They argued that Letby had been emotionally affected by the deaths. She had cared for these Bobbies. She knew their families. And searching for information about them did not necessarily mean that she had harmed them. The searches therefore became another piece of circumstantial evidence for the jury to consider. But the prosecution's case was not built entirely around behavior. Some of the most complicated evidence concerned what happened to the Bobbies medically. Evidence 6, feeding, fluids, and clinical deterioration. Several Bobbies experienced sudden medical deterioration involving feeding or intravenous treatment. In one case, the prosecution argued that excessive milk had been administered through a nasogastric tube. In other cases, prosecutors alleged that intravenous lines had been interfered with. The medical experts called by the prosecution argued that some of these events could not be adequately explained by natural complications. They argued that deliberate interference provided a better explanation. The defense disagreed. Premature Bobbies are extraordinarily vulnerable. They can deteriorate rapidly. Their feeding, breathing, circulation, and blood chemistry can change within minutes. The defense therefore argued that some of the medical events interpreted as deliberate attacks could instead have resulted from complications associated with premature birth and clinical care. That disagreement over medical interpretation would eventually become one of the defining controversies surrounding the case. But there was one final piece of evidence that prosecutors argued brought everything together. The timing. Evidence 7, the pattern that stopped. For the prosecution, the most powerful argument was not one medical test or one handwritten sentence. It was the overall pattern. The deaths and collapses had occurred repeatedly during a particular period. Lucy Letby was repeatedly present. And after she was removed from the neonatal unit in June 2016, the unusual sequence of collapses stopped. The prosecution argued that this was more than coincidence. They presented the timing as a natural experiment. Before Letby's removal, the incidents continued. After her removal, they stopped. Combined with the medical evidence, the staffing records, the handwritten notes, and the digital searches, prosecutors argued that the evidence pointed in one direction. They said the probability of all those circumstances occurring together, by chance, was extremely small. The defense rejected that interpretation. They argued that the neonatal unit itself had serious problems, that the bobbies were extremely vulnerable, and that the apparent pattern could be explained by factors other than deliberate harm. Ultimately, the jury had to decide which explanation was more convincing. And they reached their verdict. What the jury decided. On August 18, 2023, Lucy Letby was convicted of 7 murders and 6 attempted murders. She received 15 whole-life orders. The convictions followed a trial lasting approximately 10 months. Letby has consistently maintained her innocence. Her legal team has continued challenging the convictions, and the case has not disappeared from public attention. Because in the years since the trial, serious questions have been raised about parts of the medical evidence. Where the case stands now, the Criminal Cases Review Commission is examining Letby's case, following an application from her legal team. If the commission concludes that there may have been a miscarriage of justice, it can refer the convictions to the Court of Appeal. That does not mean the convictions have already been overturned. They have not. It means the case is being examined through another legal process. At the same time, an international group of medical experts has challenged aspects of the medical evidence presented at trial. Dr. Shu Lee himself was part of that review. The panel concluded that it found no medical evidence supporting deliberate harm in the 17 cases it examined. That conclusion directly conflicts with the prosecution's medical interpretation at trial. And that is why the Lucy Letby case remains so controversial. One jury heard 10 months of evidence and concluded that Lucy Letby was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The convictions remain legally valid. But medical experts have subsequently challenged some of the evidence used to reach those verdicts. So the central question remains: were the deaths and collapses evidence of deliberate attacks by a neonatal nurse? Or were some of the medical events misunderstood? The answer will ultimately depend on what the courts decide after considering the new challenges. And that is what makes this case far from finished. Because the 7 pieces of evidence that convinced a jury in 2023 are now being examined again. And this time, the question is not simply whether they looked convincing. The question is whether they can withstand fresh scrutiny.